Good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Glover, Vice President of Advocacy for the Tampa Bay Chamber. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone who has joined us on today's webinar. I know that we're living in extraordinary and uncertain times, and we want to be a resource not only for our chamber members, but also for the community at large. We put today's webinar together in cooperation with our Memorandum of Understanding partners, the Greater Bradenton Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Plant City Chamber, the Greater Riverview Chamber, the Indo-US Chamber, the North Tampa Bay Chamber, the South Tampa Chamber, the Tampa Bay LGBT Chamber, the Tampa Downtown Partnership, the Uptown Chamber, the West Shore Alliance, and the Ybor City Chamber. Before we introduce our speaker for today, if there is any media in attendance on this webinar, please note that our speaker is here to give his insight to our members as well as to the business community and would prefer not to be quoted. If you do have specific questions that you'd like for him to answer regarding today's discussion, please contact his office directly. On today's webinar, we are very excited to welcome Speaker-Designate of the Florida House, Representative Chris Sprowls. Since 2014, Representative Sprowls has represented faithfully the 65th House District, which includes Clearwater, Dunedin, Tarpon Springs, all of which are in northern Pinellas County. On September 17, 2019, the Florida House elected Representative Sprowls as the next House Speaker. He and his wife Shannon live in North Pinellas County with their two small boys, Prescott and Conrad. Mr. Speaker, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you for some remarks on the state of our state and our region. Mr. Speaker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. And I appreciate all of the folks who are on the call today and all the partners who took part in setting it up. It's great to be able to be with you. It's always better to be with you in person. But as you said, Nick, these are unique times. And certainly this is a venue that's been helpful for all of us to be able to stay in contact with each other and to chat about what's happening in Florida. So I'll kind of just talk briefly. I really want to get to your questions, but I want to kind of give you a kind of a back look of how we came out of session and then into COVID and then into shutdown and how we've kind of worked our way back from there. So as we were getting down to the legislative session, many of you who follow it very closely would say that it was probably a robust budget year in many ways, just like it has been the last couple of years. You know, lots of budget items, healthy budget, healthy reserves, healthy planning. But certainly that we're in a time of plenty in many ways in the budget cycle. You know, as we started to get towards the end of session, we obviously started getting more and more attention on COVID-19. I think even as we were coming out of session, there really wasn't talk yet about a shutdown of any kind. You know, the schools, you know, K-12 schools were still open. Higher education had maybe just started to have the conversation of maybe, you know, getting students out of the classroom. But really things were open, businesses were open, commerce was open as we began to end the legislative session. And of course, as soon as we get out of session, even between the time of getting out for the regular time and coming back, you know, 3 days later to actually vote on the budget, a lot had happened in that period of time. And of course, we know how that turns out. I think what, you know, as that happens, Nick, and I think many of you saw this, you know, I think the first thing that the governor did and the first thing that his team did with Jared Moskowitz at DEM and Secretary Ricketts at the Surgeon General at the Department of Health is really went out and said, what is it that we need to do to be prepared? You know, let's assume, you know, worst case scenario, what does that mean? So, you know, on the DOH side, that meant, you know, you had to get, you know, the appropriate medical equipment. The state had went out and procured, you know, millions and millions of masks and has since distributed millions and millions of masks. There was concern about what, you know, if the data was as bad as people, you know, the modeling as people thought it would be, that we would have a hospital bed problem. You saw people, you know, back off elective surgeries and get hospital beds to up to 25,000 to 35,000 empty hospital beds throughout the state. Really to begin to prepare for the kinds of things that, you know, we certainly didn't want to happen. But people were saying, hey, certainly could happen. And you saw a lot of that, you know, that preparation go into effect. You also saw, and it's gotten a little bit of attention recently, but it really didn't at the time, a lot of attention on your nursing homes and ALFs and areas where we saw, you know, you had a very, very vulnerable population in our elderly, the ability for any virus, you know, to spread very quickly in a enclosed area. And there was a lot of attention on that. We've had one in my district where the Department of Health strike teams had gone out, you know, really, really quickly. So you saw a lot of that preparation happening in real time. And we'll get to how we've done, but I think that it's important to note those things because I think our success at keeping the infection rate low and keeping the fatality rate low and all those things is a testament to the work that Governor DeSantis and the executive branch really put boots on the ground to make sure that those things were in a position to be successful. Even in a state like Florida where we have 20 million people and let's be honest, a lot of people kind of fleeing northeastern states to try to come here during that period of time. So, really, really great job on their part on the planning side. As we move into, a week or two into shutdown, you see massive unemployment, right? Nothing, here we are in the middle of if you would have, rewind back to the legislative session, you have a historically high stock market. If any of us would have started talking about record unemployment, we would have thought everyone was crazy, right? Nobody predicts, a global pandemic is going to result in, 1 million people. With that said, I echo the comments of the governor that, we had all these people who applied for unemployment. The system was awful and failed and broke down. So you had the executive branch have to now mobilize to fix what was a broken system. And that has been, taken up a lot of time and a lot of manpower, reallocating, thousands of state employees to make sure that we're processing applications. And I think for several weeks, that was a really, really huge problem and still is considering the volume of what's happening. The good news that I would say to you as employers is, now you've seen over $2 billion in claims that paid out to, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Now you're starting to get to those 1099 workers who weren't historically included in unemployment, but are now because of the federal government. So you've seen that play out over the last several weeks. And there's going to be a time certainly in the upcoming legislative session, we're going to have to do a look back on, how did this happen? And what were the steps? But I think the governor did the right thing in bringing in Jonathan Satter to help fix that problem and reallocating resources to do that. And I think as you start about, the governor started talking about obviously reopening the economy, getting people back to work, reopening business. He assembled a task force of a wide variety of people, myself included, Senator Simpson included, and we gave feedback over the course of a week or a week. The best to reopen the state and what that looks like. The governor did a great job of taking feedback from the business community, the health professionals, to try to do to open business as quickly and as safely as possible, but also with a mind, Nick, towards consumer confidence, right? Like a lot of this is consumer confidence driven, making sure that people feel comfortable re-engaging in commerce. So as you've seen over the last couple of weeks, the governor has rolled that out. It started with hospital beds, going back to elective surgeries and reopening outdoor spaces, and now you've seen barbers and hair salons reopen up. I think now you're going to see gyms. Gyms have come back online. So we're reopening the state for business and getting people back to work. And I think, Nick, over the course of the next several months, the biggest conversation that we need to have is how quickly can we get the economy roaring back again? How quickly can we get people back to work? How are we going to be able to provide, make sure that we have, childcare and summer camps that are open now that people are in the summer season and trying to get back and re-engaged in the employment process. And we need to, figure out as government the best way to expedite that in every way. That's what's on our mind, in addition to everything else that's coming up. And obviously, there's going to be significant budget hurdles in the years to come, which I'm sure we'll chat a little bit about. But those are things that we're going to have to tackle. But the best thing that we can do for Florida now is do what the governor has done, which is to lead from the front, to get people safely back to work and get them back to providing for their families and re-engaging in the community. With that, Nick, I'm happy to take any questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Speaker Sprowls, for those remarks and really for all you and your team are doing for our state. We'll go ahead and take some time for questions just now, but as a reminder, to please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your control panel, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. While everyone's thinking about the questions they want to ask, I do have a few house questions to get us started. Speaker Sprowls, I will ask you the same question I asked the President-designate Simpson just a few weeks ago. What does it mean for this region to have both the President of the Senate and yourself, the Speaker of the House, both being from Tampa Bay?
I appreciate that, Nick, and we should have compared notes maybe before we did this. It's obviously a great opportunity, to serve with Senator Simpson. We have the benefit of not just being, geographically close, but liking each other and getting along and having a great working relationship. I enjoy Senator Simpson greatly and his family. So it's a great opportunity. Look, one of the great things about the legislature is you have kind of this natural dynamic where you have leaders in the House and Senate who are often from different parts of the state. Certainly Senator Simpson and I come the legislature with a very Tampa Bay perspective of how things work here that might be different than other places. And I think that's always a benefit to our community when you have somebody who understands, what the challenges are in your area and how you're going to fix them. But not at all losing sight of what the greater good of the state is. I mean, the reality, what is in the greater interest of the state is in the greater interest of Tampa Bay as well. And Senator Simpson and I never lose sight of that, even though we have Tampa Bay roots. But of course, we continue to be passionate about the things that are important in Tampa Bay. And, what's interesting about that is, some of those issues tend to line up, right? I mean, most people would realize that, things like the child welfare system, for example, and I think my good friend, Representative Chris Vallo, who's a champion for reforming the child welfare system, might be on the call today. But, Senator Simpson, that's a great passion of his, given his life experience, and he and I, have a mutual passion for making sure that happens. The reason I say that is, in Tampa Bay, we have one of the, the certainly the hottest bed in the state of removals of children from homes, both in Hillsborough County and Pinellas County and Pasco County. So we happen to be the epicenter of what is a statewide issue, and I think that gives us a unique perspective to help Tampa Bay and also to help the rest of the state.
Thank you. You hit on this just a moment ago. Obviously, we are in unprecedented economic times. Can you speak to us just a little bit about the belt tightening that'll take place potentially over the summer as you and the team think about ways to make up for the reduction in Florida's tax revenue?
Sure. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind there is the uncertainties that exist, right? Like, I don't think it is certainly not a predestined conclusion that we will be back in the summer. And people say, well, how can that be? I mean, the reality is that we there's a lot we don't know, right? We know that we have significant economic challenges coming. Obviously, sales tax collection is way down. Not surprising to anyone on the call. Not surprising to anyone on the call that gas tax is way down. In fact, the first area we saw hit before the shutdown was gas tax, right? So clearly, Nick, people had, even though businesses hadn't been shut down and things like that, the community was responding by probably leaving their house a lot less. So gas tax collection was way down. So there's no question that those are challenges, as well as the fact that during this time of getting the state prepared, there's been a great deal of revenue that has been spent that was in reserve on this pandemic, and that's going to be a challenge. The uncertainty exists because there's been $5 billion plus appropriated by the federal government to Florida. Now, much of that money has strings as far as how it can be spent and so forth, and there's a lot of conversation happening, at the federal level about giving states flexibility, particularly states like Florida, who, and I'm sure Senator Simpson mentioned this, we come into this pandemic as a state that has been extremely fiscally sound, has billions of dollars in reserves, has a AAA bond rating, is top 5 Forbes magazine for business climate, all of these great things that you'd want to see on a portfolio sheet if you were looking at a company, right? I always say if if Florida was a stock, it wouldn't be good, it would be great. And everybody would want to buy us. So we come into this with that kind of record. So I think the federal government is looking at, hey, do we give Florida the flexibility to do what they need to do with that $5 billion that's in the best interest of Florida, because they know how to do this and have a proven track record. And I think if that happens, that pushes us far later in the season to figure out what we need to do as far as the budget is concerned. And look, I actually think more time is better, and I think the governor's been right in not asking the legislature for the budget. He could have asked for it and said, hey, send me the budget. I'll sign it. I won't sign it. I'll veto. I won't veto. He hasn't done that. And I think the reason he hasn't done that, and this is me speculating, although he may have said it, is, that he wants as much time as possible to figure out where the chips are on the board and what that means for the state. And I think that's the right and thoughtful approach.
And so I'm assuming that also is reflective of the bills that he has not signed that are non-budgetary in nature, really just sort of waiting for the resources gap to be filled before making decisions on that. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, not every bill obviously has a dollar on it, right? So that may or may not be part of it. I think as far as if it's a bill that doesn't have a dollar figure, it'd probably just be the governor's busy. I mean, the governor obviously is dealing with with a huge issue and trying to get the economy back online. So if he's got more time to sign a bill dealing with with something that's not urgent, then he can take more time to do that.
Excellent. So we have a variety of business owners and operators on the call, of course, today. Is the state going to pursue protections against lawsuits for businesses that are in compliance with the CDC guidelines as well as with the governor's mandates?
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions about that. I mean, I think that's super reasonable. I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, the idea of, suing a business owner because somebody happened to get COVID and you're not even really sure, candidly, it was related to their employment, is not good for the marketplace, and also fundamentally unfair for the justice system. So, I think that's a super reasonable conversation. I also think, you saw a class action lawsuit that's been now filed against the university system because, or at least to one university, because people, students have had to take online classes. And I'm not going to comment on the legal nature of that lawsuit, but on the face of it, it's ridiculous to me, right? I mean, the idea that we're in the middle of a global pandemic and someone has had to take something online. Floridians have been inconvenienced in losing their jobs. They've been inconvenienced in not being able to send their children to school. These aren't the kinds of things that need to be paralyzing, our economy or paralyzing our ability to get people, back in the learning environment. So, there's some ridiculousness out there. But I also think, Nick, that a lot of this is providing, stability and comfort to the business community to know that, those kinds of things aren't something that we think is reasonable, and we don't.
So we have one of our questions that just came through online. Florida is one of 14 states that has not yet expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Is Medicaid expansion the answer potentially for Florida's low-income residents, and will it help us prime the economy?
No, I actually think, based on the conversation we just had, right, about the strenuous nature of our budget and what that looks like for the state, I actually think it in a lot of ways does the opposite thing, right? So, obviously one of our largest budget liabilities in the state budget is Medicaid, right? About a third of our entire state budget, picture this, $92 billion of a pie. A third of that pie is K-12 education. A third of that pie is healthcare. The vast majority of that part of that 33+% is Medicaid. And then the last third of the pie is literally everything else you could think of. That's a state function. So, that puts a ton of strain on that healthcare budget. You got to remember now, Medicaid rolls are expanding rapidly every day right now because people are out of work. So people who weren't in Medicaid because they were either covered through their employer or a variety of other different ways. They had insurance through their employer that they were paying, or high deductible plans, or whatever it may be. Now that they're out of work, that Medicaid expenditure level for the state is going to go up exponentially. So in addition to being a loss in revenue, we're also going to have what is already maybe our hardest area of the budget to control, really starting to spiral because of the fact that it's been an increased roll. So I actually think it does the opposite thing. I think the best thing that we can do for the people now who've come into the Medicaid rolls who weren't there before was obviously try to do everything we can to get commerce re-engaged so that they can re-enter the workforce. So I think that's a huge part of it. I also think the other part that's worth noting, Nick, and almost no one's ever brought it up. I always seem like I'm the one who brings it up, but here in Tampa Bay, where Representative Val and I are from, in Pinellas County, we have the most densely populated county in Florida for individuals with disabilities. When we start to make budget priorities, especially in years where, you're not going to have a lot in the way of revenue, we all make a list, who's our most vulnerable. We have to take care of, the disabled. We have to take care of children. We want to take care of pregnant women and the elderly and people who have physical or mental disabilities. So we have to do all those things. Medicaid expansion wouldn't cover any one of the people I just mentioned, not a single dollar. So as we begin to make those budget priorities, we need to focus on our most vulnerable population while making sure that we're making the most fiscally sound, decisions for the state.
So we keep going back to the budget. Obviously, it's top of mind for you and your folks there in the House. I know it's top of mind in the Senate as well. Given that, what specific steps should the legislature take to make sure that we can continue to balance the budget in this economic downturn? Are there other opportunities for us to change the way that we do business during the budgetary process?
Yeah, I'll separate those conversations a little bit into, is there a difference between how we do business, and then we can talk about how that means money-wise. But I think one of the opportunities that comes in crisis, right? And there's opportunity in every crisis, no matter how good, no matter how bad, and is to remake the world. Rethink the world, to remake the world. You get different experiences. Your community and your state get different experiences that you can use. I'll use an example of K-12 education. 5 months ago, there might have been certainly some virtual learning in K-12, but nowhere near the mass scale that we have now. Now you have teachers who maybe never taught online or never used digital learning, who had to essentially retrain themselves under high pressure cooker scenarios to deliver content and deliver an education to their children. And they've done an absolutely amazing job. And in doing so, we've created tens of thousands of experts on digital learning that we never had before in our education system. That's an opportunity to remake digital learning in a way that is in the best interest of children for them to deliver high content. That didn't exist before. You know, I read something not long ago that Isaac Newton was in quarantine during the plague when he thought about many of his laws for science. So there's great opportunity that comes, and every time we've seen an economic crisis, you know, I go back to 07, 08, you mentioned Medicaid, Nick. You know, that's when we had Medicaid managed care reform. And, you know, there's an opportunity when we have these kinds of crisis and budgets are tight to make decisions that are in the best long-term interest of the state that maybe during really, really good times, you know, you wouldn't do because, you know, things are good and why rock the boat? You know, there's certainly no hesitancy to rock the boat when you have to. So I think that there's great opportunity. And I think on the budget front, you know, that same opportunity exists to reprioritize, you know, what's going to be the most important thing for us in the long term. And that's going to be a conversation that, you know, the House and Senate are going to have as far as what those priorities look like and how can we be innovative and what are the things that, you know, that we are doing that we don't need to be doing. And what does that look like in the future? Because as we move forward, we obviously are going to balance the budget. We also want to maintain our AAA bond rating. We are also Florida, you know, so we always have to be prepared for disasters. You know, I mentioned this during my designation speech about how, you know, I believe that Florida should have a disaster recovery fund, right? And I at the time, I wasn't probably thinking about a global pandemic. I was thinking about the natural disasters we're very familiar with, like storms and hurricanes. But we are Florida, and we have those things, and we should be prepared, you know, for those types of crisis, and not have to depend all the time on the federal government. And I think that's an opportunity now as we go into the session to start thinking about those things, so that you know, God forbid, we, regardless of what happens in our future, whether that's a hurricane, which eventually will happen, or something else, that we are more prepared than any other state in America.
Excellent. So we're talking about some of the things that we'll stop doing. Let's get pretty specific about the opportunities for revenue that we've, of course, heard over the course of the last years in the media. There have been a variety of proposals on the table, including renegotiating the compact with the Seminole tribe, as well as closing the tax loophole on online retailers. Can you help us understand those specific revenue opportunities, as well as additional ones that you and your team are kicking around?
Sure. I mean, I think the Seminole Compact is probably an easier number to identify. I think the sales tax, online sales taxes, you know, the number has changed wildly over the last several years, in part because you had you know, entities like Amazon who several years ago weren't paying sales tax and now are. You know, most of the massive retailers who are engaging in the online space are paying sales tax. So I think that number has changed. Obviously, the conversation about the compact is usually about you know, a fairly you know, identifiable range of money to the state of Florida. You know, and I think as you look at, you know, certainly the legislature has and will continue to have the conversation about, you know, what's happening online. But as you talk about the Seminole Compact, because I know that's been on a lot of people's mind and was on people's mind during the legislative session, there was conversations about it. You know, look, I think that we're a willing partner to have that conversation about what a gaming compact would look like. Well, I am not a believer that, you know, that anybody, whether you're a business owner or the state of Florida, should make a bad deal because you feel pressure financially. I think most of the business owners would say, hey, you have to resist the urge to make a bad deal when you feel that pressure, right? So, you know, we're prepared to do what we need to do. At the same time, if we have willing partners who want to have a conversation about what a you know, kind of a global gaming conversation looks like, and that's just more than just a compact. I mean, I think it involves pari-mutuels, it involves all kinds of different things, you know, in the gaming space. You know, we're open to doing that, and obviously it's been a challenge, Nick, I think, for the legislature because there's so many different parts to gaming, and a lot of it ends up being regional and having regional challenges. But you know, certainly there was those conversations were happening in earnest, and I think probably would have continued to happen in earnest, but for, you know, but for the COVID situation that we found ourselves in. So, you know, I think Senator Simpson and I are in the same position, which is we're both open to continuing to talk.
So if you wouldn't mind drilling down just a little bit more for folks who might not be as familiar with what we're talking about, the dynamics in the Seminole Compact versus pari-mutuel agreement, a little bit of historical context versus opportunities that might exist.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's exclusivity that was in the compact that was existing, you know, prior to, you know, the Seminoles stopping to pay. You know, that exclusivity included, of which we're very familiar with, Tampa Bay, you know, exclusive, you know, kind of gaming rights to the casino in Tampa Bay. Obviously, as you talk about pari-mutuels, you know, without getting, you know, too much in the weeds. There's conversations about, designated player games, poker essentially that exists at pari-mutuels that the Seminoles say violated the compact. There was litigation about that. There's a desire, I think, this is all public from the Seminoles of maybe wanting some additional games. There's also a lot of dormant licenses and opportunities to restrict gaming statewide. So there's a lot of moving pieces to it, Nick, and that's, it's going to be an ongoing conversation about how do you balance those things. Obviously, you also had the constitutional amendment dealing with dog racing, which the voters decided to ban dog racing moving forward. So now those existing pari-mutuels who maybe had dog racing and poker, they want to know, are they staying open to do poker, or eventually are they going to have to close their doors because of the compact? So all of those conversations, need to take place in really one global deal.
So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the push-pull that naturally exists between local municipalities as well as the legislature. Obviously, you received our legislative agenda. One of the things that's important to us is making sure that local decisions are made locally. Pinellas County, of course, has so many different cities, municipalities within the county. Spend just a little bit of time talking to us about the role of state government versus local government and the push-pull that exists there, what we can do to strengthen home rule here in Tampa, as well as, of course, Hillsborough County, Pinellas, and Pasco.
No, it's a great, I'll try not to filibuster on that one because there's a lot to unpack there. I'll start with this, kind of premise, and that is that, there's obviously there's roles for local and state government. And, people say, hey, there's push-pull, to use your phrase, there's this push-pull between them. The push-pull is by design, right? You want push-pull between your various different branches of government, right? It's what gives us checks and balances, or what gives us fundamental fairness is a natural push-pull, whether that's from state to local government, whether it's House to Senate, whether it's, the judiciary versus the legislative branch, all of that push-pull type stuff is what hopefully gets us a more fair outcome in the long run. So I'll say that, but I'll also say that, look, any government, whether that government is state government, whether that is certainly federal government, that's an easy one, or whether it's local government, nobody gets a blank check. Nobody gets a blank check as to who's the better decision maker. The idea that you're a better decision maker because you're the state, or the better decision maker because you're local, you're a better decision maker if you make the best decisions. So, where you are isn't necessarily the best vantage point. And I've said that to our folks in local government. I think they do a lot of them do a very, very great job, and there's a natural push-pull. But you also have natural intersections, Nick. You have the legislature. If the legislature convened and said, hey, we want to have a statewide emergency response plan where, all the fire trucks and ambulances, and they all operate off this plan, we'd all agree that's a terrible idea, right? That's something that needs to be done locally. Communities are very, very different. If we want to micromanage the sewer, although sometimes it seems like we need to, that's not a state conversation. That's a local government conversation. But then there's that intersection, right? Where, Uber is a great example. And the Tampa Bay Chamber was a leader in helping, lift the restrictions on ride sharing throughout the state. But imagine that, if I had somebody in Palm Harbor who wanted to come over to Hillsborough County, Nick, to get lunch and then go to the airport. Well, you had the PTC and you had all kinds of, government that had collided to prevent people from engaging in the business, in commerce and business. So it took the state having to come in and say, okay, this is intra-state commerce, and we're going to regulate it at the state level so that we don't have this kind of nonsense, because you can't be able to, drop a guy off a mile from the airport and have him walk the rest of the way. That's not going to work. So, there's a role for local government. There's a role for state government. It's figuring out what that balance is and realize that sometimes we're going to overlap a little bit. And, we just got to do the best job of trying to figuring out the best outcome for families.
So on those same lines, obviously transportation is very important here in Tampa Bay. We have so many people who are moving to this region every single day. We are, quite frankly, worried. We're worried because of the home rule issues. We're having this all for transportation dialogue come to a head in the Supreme Court. We have so much revenue that's disappeared. You mentioned the gas tax and others, sales tax. What do you think that dearth of revenue that would have been dedicated perhaps to transportation does for our transportation woes in Tampa Bay? And what can we do to get around that?
That's actually, it's a great follow-up to your last question, right? Which, about the home rule question, because there's a perfect example. We've all been talking about for years now about, a regional vision for transportation. It's not because we all just like each other, although we do. It's because we realize that there's also practical implications. If we're all making this one big plan, it's going to work better. It's going to be more efficient. There's going to be more opportunities when the federal government is out for those infrastructure dollars to go to Tampa Bay. And yet, no matter how, I feel like no matter how far down the field we get, there is particularly a local government or a local government, folks who come forward and say, I've got a big problem, and try to kind of derail the whole thing. And that's a challenge. And what I've said to people locally is, look, you have got to get on the same page as to where you are. I put a study, just for as an example, I put a study in the transportation budget a couple of years ago about consolidation of the metropolitan planning organizations in Pinellas, Hillsborough, and Pasco County. And part of the reason to do that is because if we had one large metropolitan MPO, although the local governments would be able to manage their HART, manage their PSTA, and do those things, we would have more opportunity to be an attractive investment for federal infrastructure dollars. But part of the reason that hasn't moved forward is because, although that there's suggested that there's appetite at the local level, we end up hitting roadblocks. So, I think it's something that the state leaders in the Tampa Bay delegation have wanted to for a number of years to help push forward, and we're getting some pushback. And I think where we could really, get some help, I think, is from the business community who, to engage with your local leaders and figure out, if the plan that is out there isn't the one that they need, or they don't think is workable, then what plan is? Is there a plan that they think is workable that we can begin to move forward as one region?
There will certainly be no shortage of ideas from this region as it relates to transportation issues. I promise you that. So why don't we just open it up to you, Mr. Speaker? I would love to get your insight on some of the critical issues that you'd like to champion during your time as Speaker as you take the reins. Tell us what's in the hopper.
Well, I appreciate that. I said this during my designation speech that I don't subscribe to kind of the model where, certainly presiding officers, we all have passions and ideas and things that we want to do. But, this idea that, hey, it's, there's two people in the legislature that set all the agenda and that's what we do. I don't subscribe to that. I don't think that's the right thing. I do subscribe to is that we have a lot of talented members who understand the state, and we're going to build a consensus as to what those agenda items is. When I said that during my designation speech, Nick, I talked about a lot of issues that are important to me, right? Everything from, where we move forward in environmental policy to how do we tackle fatherlessness in our community, and all kinds of things, in between. I mentioned the hurricane, disaster fund and how we spend state resources. So, but I think that's an ongoing, conversation with the members to create what the best agenda is, and move forward. And candidly, what's that old saying, make a plan and God laughs, right? And certainly that's the case with the situation that we're in. Had we thought a couple months ago that we would be, facing some of the economic challenges that we're facing now, we didn't feel that way. Again, surging stock market, record unemployment, recordly low unemployment, throughout the state, throughout the country, and those things have changed. And but I'm not pessimistic about it changing. Somebody asked me the other day, if you could change spots, if you could have been here 2 years before, or, maybe 2 years from now and not have to deal with this, wouldn't that be better? And I said, no, that would not be better. And Senator Simpson and I have had this conversation that, it is times like this that leadership matters. It is times like this that who we elect truly matters. It is times like this that the CEOs or the business, the people who run businesses who are on this call, it is times like this that their leadership matters more than ever. When you have recordly low unemployment and the stock market soaring and all of our, investments are doing fantastic, that's great. And it took a lot of work to do that. But it is in times of crisis that we need real leaders and real discipline and some people who are going to have, not what's good in the next 3 months or 3 years, but in the next 30 years in the state. And that's a difficult thing to do for politicians generally. And I think it's particularly difficult in a term limited environment to say, I'm not going to look past my time. When I'm well gone and forgotten and nobody remembers who I am anymore, did I make the right decisions to tee up the people who are going to be there 30 years from now? And that's where my head is. And I think that's where Senator Simpson's head is.
Well, very good. You mentioned a variety of initiatives. Obviously, we passed 207 bills this previous session. A variety of them, however they go on, they'll eventually get signed into law by the governor. There are quite a few really, really good bills that did not make it over their hump, whether they didn't have a companion bill in the Senate or the House. What is left over that were really strong quality bills that help people in Tampa Bay? Do you expect to possibly come back for the 2021 session?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Many people will tell you, and I think this chamber's had that experience where sometimes it takes, several years to pass, good legislation for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's, sometimes it's lack of bandwidth, during the session, or sometimes it's, there's a problem, particular committee reference. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. So, there's always good things that are left over, to kind of start up again. The House has done that a number of years where, we picked up things, and some of the policy that we passed over the last couple of years has been stuff that the House has passed for the last, probably decade or more. And just kind of we're signed into law and finished. So, there's definitely stuff left over that we'll come back to. And then there'll be a lot of, every session, there's a lot of new things and a lot of new challenges that we have to tackle. And those things will come back as well.
Well, excellent. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Speaker Sprowls for his time. I know how busy you are. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all. Have a great day. Be well and be safe.